Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone. Thank you for being here for this important conversation this evening. I'm very happy to introduce Mariah Lichtenstern. Mariah is an investor and an entrepreneur at the intersection of technology, entertainment, and venture capital. Mariah accelerates positive social, economic, and environmental impact through entrepreneurship. She's an alumna of UC Berkeley, USC, and UCLA, and she's the founding partner of Diverse City Ventures, which was launched out of Sacramento, California. And she launched the Sacramento, California chapter of the Founder Institute, which was recognized in Forbes magazine as the third most gender diverse chapter in the world. She has a background in financial services and the arts, including as an executive producer at Lighted Star Entertainment and founder of CineShares, which is shaking up the film production paradigm and specializes in bringing to life projects with themes that address underserved niche audiences or feature diverse perspectives. She serves as an advisor for the California Green Energy Fund's CalSeed Initiative, Berkeley Skydeck, Village Capital Finance Forward, Fourth Wave Female Founder Accelerator, Hayden AI Ethics Advisory, and Yale University School of Medicine's Digital Innovation and Diversity Initiative. She serves on the boards of Fourth Wave, Startup SAC, and the Sacramento Metro Chamber of Commerce. She is a member of UCLA Ventures and an Aspen Tech Policy Hub Fellow, where she developed the Tech Funding Equity Project to advocate solutions to the tech industry funding gap. So Mariah, welcome. You are involved in quite a few projects, and thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
Absolutely. So we love what you're doing with your Fund Diverse City Ventures and the many other projects that you're focused on. You're an amazing person to follow on LinkedIn because you're always highlighting really important projects related to diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging. So I encourage everybody to follow you. It seems like you are just involved in many things. We know that, I'm happy to have you here for this important conversation tonight. We know that the venture community has made progress related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we still have a long way to go. But it has been a focal point for many funds, especially over the past 2 years. And I think most investors by now do acknowledge that they're limiting the potential of their portfolio if they're not integrating a diverse array of perspectives and founders who really understand their own niche audiences well and know uniquely how to engage them. So this has really become a business imperative for both venture funds and startups. And I just love the way that you approach the topic of diversity, inclusion, and belonging in venture capital and entrepreneurship, that it's not only the right thing to do, but it's critical for business. And ultimately, it's about bringing people together and moving forward together as a venture and startup community and also as society at large. And I love that you have on your website, Diversity Includes You. I think that's just a powerful starting point for a conversation around the importance of diversity and inclusion, whether you're a fund or a startup. So without further ado, I will kick it over to you and go ahead and pull up your deck.
Awesome. Well, again, I want to thank everyone who's joining in today, and I want to encourage you to put questions in the Q&A section or in the chat, either as yourself or anonymously. I know that there's probably not too many questions that I haven't heard around this topic. And I'd like you to consider this a safe space to get your questions answered or to share challenges that you may have, and just to know that I know that this is not an easy or comfortable topic for everyone. It's not always easy or comfortable for me. And maybe I have less of the privilege of not addressing it, but I just want to put that out there for this to be a safe space, for it to be productive for you. And I also want you to know that there are a lot of rewards of doing the work, and not least among them are building confidence, insight, and dare I say, delight that DEI mastery brings. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started, and I'll just share what we're going to cover today on the next slide. So I'm going to go into a little bit about my background. Thank you so much, Courtney, for the introduction. Yes, I like to do a lot of things with startups, and I feel very privileged to do that. So we'll get into a bit of my personal background, and then we'll talk about what diversity, equity, and inclusion means, diverse perspectives, and you know, the mindset for DEI. And then we'll go into why it matters for startups and some cultural context in our industry, particularly stuff that I've seen as an Aspen Tech Policy Hub Fellow, and that I focused on in that role, the benefits of DEI, some myths and common challenges. And again, please do, throw any questions or experiences that you've had in the chat or in the Q&A section. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Tech Funding Equity Startup DEI Pledge and some strategies for addressing the challenges that startups face and trying to incorporate this into their business strategy. And hopefully we'll have ample time for Q&A. So, okay, let's go ahead and get started.
Yes, absolutely. And Mariah, sorry to interrupt you, just because I'm sharing the presentation, I might not see questions come through. If you want to field them,
look,
or we could do them at the end as well.
Right on. Okay, yeah, that would be best, but I will be checking the chat periodically. Hi, Guillermo, it's good to see you. All right, so, again, Courtney gave some background about, my professional life, but I'm gonna kind of share a little bit of a different lens about me. I am multi-ethnic or mixed. My parents are both deceased, but my mom and my stepdad identified as white. My biological father, who I met at 12 years old, would identify as Black, although we're multicultural on both sides. I was born and raised in California, born in Oakland. Spent my childhood in Colusa, California, a very rural area. My parents were both working class. My mother was a registered nurse. My stepdad was an Air Force veteran who had a small storm window business before becoming a trucker. My biological father was a disabled Navy veteran who had a body shop and a gas station, all while having several bands and being a fine artist, which he focused on after becoming disabled. I'm a first-generation university grad. I landed in foster care as a teenager. I married an immigrant from Botswana, which is a small country in Africa about the size of Texas. I'm also the mother of Naledi, and I usually have a photo here of my family, but it's not there today. So all of these things about me personally inform how I operate professionally, as well as the experiences and barriers that I've had in my professional life. And by sharing with you, I hope that this creates a greater sense of relatability or understanding that looking at my professional credentials alone just would not. And perhaps it creates a feeling of empathy or relatability or shared humanity that's beyond the transactional. And that's always important in the human aspect of business, which computers cannot replace. Even though Machina was Ex Machina, I think it is how you say it, it had me wondering about that. And this is especially true when it comes to DEI and belonging. So next slide. So we're having this discussion in the midst of a tipping point and an awakening around systemic racism in the context of how biases of all kinds get entrenched. And at the Aspen Institute, there is some information on a racial equity theory of change that shares how whenever there's progress in an area where inequity is entrenched, we should always anticipate retrenchment, a system of maintaining the hegemonic power dynamics that we now see are causing existential crises like climate change and massive income inequality. So I just want to set that context. And here, we see, of course, George Floyd. And then we also see that NASDAQ has put forth a proposal to the SEC to require board diversity. So it's like, why does diversity matter? Well, it matters because it's the right thing to do. It matters because it makes dollars and cents. But, sometimes when people don't do things voluntarily, we have to move in a regulatory framework or otherwise. And so it's become more of an imperative. Okay, next. So let's just break down what DEI and B are, because I can't assume that everybody knows it. And to be honest, even I need a refresher every now and then, right? So diversity really refers to a variety of characteristics that make people unique. And as Courtney shared with you, we have a motto at Diversity Ventures that diversity includes you. Because one of the things that I saw getting back into the tech industry many years ago was that when diversity came up, it was a trigger. And a lot of people felt that it meant excluding them or taking away their slice of the pie. And that is not what is meant to be there. It's really about creating a bigger pie. So diversity does include you, whatever your background, walk of life, gender is, it includes you. So gender, ethnicity, culture, class, sexuality, nationality, all of those things. And we should also consider that we're often taught or pressured to conform to or assimilate into majority culture. So, even if you're looking at maybe a woman or someone of color, they may feel pressure to not bring their full selves or not bring their perspectives, or to conform. And so it's important to recognize that no culture is a monolith. No individual is they may have affinities, but they are individuals. And it's also important to not only recognize diversity within affinity groups, but to encourage cultural optimization over this idea of culture fit, which we have kind of, been encouraged to practice in the past several years. And so an example of this is how studies have shown that it takes having 3 women on board seats to create a critical mass that optimizes financial outcomes. And I'll actually just go ahead and share a little link here to that study. Okay, so that is diversity. Now we'll go on to the next slide to equity. And it's a term that factors in justice and fairness. And this really requires examining the root cause that creates disparate outcomes. And we should be mindful of the lived experiences versus, the common beliefs. I wanted to share this particular slide because on the left, I often see something similar to this of, to kind of illustrate what equity is, right? And it makes a lot of sense, right? Some people have, disadvantages because of historical issues and they may need a little more help, but it can also be kind of interpreted like, okay, well, this little short person right here, probably shouldn't even be doing this job because they can't reach the apples. And why do they get more, than this person over here, right? But, when we talk about perspective, and we're going to touch on that momentarily, look at what's on the right. This is something that resonates much more deeply to me as a woman of color, right? Because instead of saying, oh, I need more help because I'm so at disadvantage, it's really like, I am capable, I am strong, and there's so many more roadblocks for me, right? And so that's kind of, something to keep in mind when we have these discussions and when we're, incorporating not only cultural sensitivity, which I think the illustration on the right represents, but also cultural competency, which I think the image, at least from my perspective, on the right represents. Okay, next. So going back, did we skip? It should be, let's go back to the DEI and B.
Okay.
So it's going up. So inclusion refers to the behaviors and cultural norms that make space for people to be valued and included in a decision. So, an example that comes to mind of a lack of inclusion, there's a movie called The Spook Who Sat by the Door. And some of us who are into, who are movie buffs know about this, but it's a blaxploitation era film about a Black CIA agent who was not included in the culture, and he became quite revolutionary. So inclusion is really about not just being someone who's in the room to check a box and be, the optics, and have, your peers assume that you're the diversity hire. It's really about being included and honored in the decision-making process. And that contributes to the B, which often gets left out in the DEI discussions, which is a sense of belonging. Now, belonging is not something that you can, control to the extent that you can diversity, equity, and inclusion and practices around that, but it's something that you can influence. Someone can feel more of a sense of belonging when they feel that they are accepted in the culture. Okay, next slide. Which should be perspective. There we go. So, I'm just going to throw this rhetorical question out there and feel free to, put anything in the chat. But how do diverse perspectives inform diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in startups? How do your experiences and perspectives inform your thoughts on diversity, equity, and inclusion? And again, you can just think about this internally, or you can share thoughts that you might have. All right, going on to the next slide. And so let's do a little bit of mindful bubble bursting. So this is kind of addressing some of, the myths, right, around, diversity that oftentimes we just accept, and we might not even know that we're believing in myths. But when it comes to the bubble, what does bubble mean? We've heard of the tech bubble, right? We've heard of the housing bubble. We've heard of living in a privilege bubble or information bubble. And really it's a type of segregation or isolation. And I'm gonna go ahead and be a little bit provocative and say it's a type of ghetto, okay? And let's go on to the next slide there and just define that. So this is literally a dictionary definition of ghetto. And, I've actually heard this term quite insensitively thrown around in a joking fashion. Uh, but when we look at the historical context of what is a ghetto, it's part of a city or a slum, usually occupied by minorities. And that's typically the first thing that comes to mind in the United States. And historically, it refers to the Jewish quarters of a city, right? And we know that historically, the Jewish population has been targeted, was a victim of genocide, and that happens in different cultures around the world. But that's the origin of the term, right? And then there's another definition of it that I'm using here in this bubble example, which is an isolated or segregated group or area. So whether we're in Silicon Valley or in a suburb or whatever the case may be, in this example, they gave a sentence, a middle-class ghetto of prosperous professionals. And sometimes we don't recognize the ghettos that we're in, right? The ghettos of the mind. So I just wanted to be a little provocative and share that there. All right, moving on to the bubbles.
So interesting. I never knew that it came from a very neutral meaning.
Well,
Word.
It really isn't that neutral, because the ghettos are really where Jewish people were confined and where pogroms happened, and where that culture was segregated from other cultures within Europe, right? Because of whatever rhetoric was going around at the time, and that is just one example. And here in America, we have other examples of these cultural dynamics, right? And whatever countries that, founders and 500 startups or others who may be listening in may be from, it may be unique there. It might be language, it might be geography, it might be class, right? So it's just, again, important when we're doing this work on DEI to be mindful of what bubbles might we be in. Right. And sometimes it's fun to burst those bubbles, right? And see things a little differently. And that's why I like to put, this image, like I blow bubbles for my daughter, or she blows bubbles and she wants to pop those little bubbles. And so we're going to do a little bit of that today. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. Again, we're focusing mostly on the US, but there is a global context. So again, diversity in the country that your startup may be launching in might be around gender, it might be around immigration, which is a hot topic in some places. It might be about geography, class. So again, feel free to comment or share, in your geography or, in your experiences, what diversity means to you. But I also want to, in this conversation, just talk about, how can we apply empathy and conscious leadership to how we help to unpack the issues that have led to a need for these DEI initiatives and conversations. All right, moving on. So, this is something else that I just wanted to put out there as a framework, and I'll also put this link in the chat. I was in a leadership discussion recently, and we talked about how are people like computers? We're all, in tech here. And I just love this talk by Jill Bolt Taylor called My Stroke of Insight. She has a TED Talk. She also has a book. And she describes, she had a stroke and she was experiencing as a neural anatomist about, like what's happening in my brain, neuroanatomist about what's going on in my brain. And she described the right brain as a parallel processor and the left brain as more of a serial processor, right? And so there's a lot of ways that our brains are similar, right, to computers, but there's this question that came up, how are our brains, how are we different than computers? We've had the Turing test, the Marcus test, the Lovelace test, now the reverse Turing with the CAPTCHAs, right? But some of the things that make us unique as human beings is that we have emotions like fears, and we have futuring or imagination. We imagine what will happen in certain scenarios. Maybe it's like, oh, if we open our borders, this will happen, or if we don't have these certain voting stipulations, this will happen. My policies won't, get forwarded, or, there'll be a change that I'm afraid of, right? So that's part of the human element of all of this. And I just want to, again, throw out another rhetorical question. How do you think and feel about emotions versus rational thinking? What are the strengths and what are the weaknesses of each? Because clearly there are strengths of human beings having emotions. And I often say as a woman, we're sometimes, criticized for being emotional, but like, who is not emotional? What war was not started over emotion, right? We're all emotional as human beings. And how can we leverage those strengths and also be aware of the weaknesses, right? And the same is true of rational thinking, because if you say, okay, I'm going to be very left brain and I'm just going to think about the bottom line, but that results in plastic in the ocean and environmental destruction, then what are the pros and cons of this quote unquote rational thinking? What are we missing because we're not applying a different lens? Okay, so moving on. So why does diversity, equity, and inclusion even matter? And why is it becoming more of a policy issue? Well, here's just a couple of examples. Citi Global Policy Solutions came out with some research recently that shows that we have lost 16 trillion in US GDP, gross domestic product, in the last 20 years alone due to the US racial wealth gap and racism in our country. 16 trillion just in 20 years. And you also see McKinsey and Company, they're saying that we can add 4 to 6% to our GDP by 2028, and that's a conservative estimate, by eradicating that racial wealth gap, for example. Okay, next slide. Here, in this one, this is from the Center for Global Policy Solutions, and they did a study a few years ago and shows that we lose over 9 million jobs per year and 300 billion in annual national income every year due to discriminatory finance practices. So we're going to just touch a little bit on a case study that, again, goes back to the work that I've done as an Aspen Tech Policy Hub Fellow around closing the funding gap, right? And this is, partially where I stumbled upon some of this impact of a lack of diversity, equity, and inclusion in our startup ecosystem. So next slide. So the funding gap is a term that describes a lack of equitable startup funding for underrepresented founders, specifically Black, Latinx, and female. So this is the policy problem that I set out to solve as an Aspen Tech Policy Hub Fellow. And we know that about 13% of the US population is Black and almost 17% is Latinx. Of that, I think about 2% identify as non-white, but less than 3% of venture-backed founders are from these ethnic groups. Okay, next slide. And not only are there racial disparities, there are also gender disparities. Let's go ahead and go forward one, please, Courtney. So here you can see that, because of historical roots, of gender discrimination and dynamics, we've seen the Me Too movement, right? And then even some, retrenchment around that. Like, I don't even want to deal with women because I don't want to get in trouble. A full 82% of venture-backed funding teams are all male and only 6% are all female. And even if you throw in the mixed teams, it's overwhelmingly male. But we know that women are over-indexing in entrepreneurship. So there's something missing there. Next slide. I'm going to the next one.
Sorry, my internet might be a little slow, but I'm on the DEI benefits slide now.
Yes. Okay. Oh, wonderful. Okay. You're doing a wonderful job, Courtney. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for keeping us all on track here. So we know that there are benefits to diversity, equity, inclusion. This one is, an often cited McKinsey analysis that shows that the likelihood of companies that are in the top quartile of diversity outperform the bottom quartile. And when you just factor in gender, it's a 15% difference. And when you also layer in ethnic diversity, is 35%. So we know this. Next slide. We've also heard for years, especially in Silicon Valley, which is the epicenter of technology startups. Many people dream of coming to Silicon Valley and San Francisco. We've heard that it's a meritocracy and that a lack of diversity is a pipeline problem. Or a lack of talent, but this is just not true. So here you can see in deconstructing the pipeline myth in the case for more diverse fund managers, Kaufman Fellows, Colin West, Gopinath Sundamurthy, and Marla Nichols found that neither education or the number of underrepresented founders in the pipeline could explain how underfunded Black, Latinx, and female founders are. And they found that ethnically diverse founding and leadership teams have higher realized returns on positive exits. So believe it or not, this is also true of talent in your startups, right? Okay, so moving on to next slide. And this is, partly why venture capital is also overwhelmingly homogenous because people practice homophily. They tend to bring people onto their teams that are like them. And that may be that they go to the same school, like 40% of startup funding goes to Ivy League founders, and more specifically Stanford and Harvard, which is also, where there's huge networks of very, very wealthy families, right? And so, there's a trust that's built into coming from kind of similar backgrounds and experiences. And then, it could also be geographic or gender or, the sports that you play, the teams that you like, all of that factors into our just natural human way of doing business. So next slide. That's also part of why we see women and people of color are very much underrepresented in venture capital, and that reflects who also gets investment and support on the startup side. And so we're getting closer here to how, you are part of the solution as founders. And I know that, there's some VCs and others on the call as well. All right, so next slide. Then, we're not going to go into this very deeply today, but there are also just, systemic issues that impact the diversity of, who gets to pursue entrepreneurship, like founders, like, many of yourselves. And so like in this example, most Americans don't qualify as accredited investors. They have the freedom and discretion to invest in the private market. So many of you may have done Regulation D, 506B or C offerings, and there's regulations that make it such that, a person of color who comes from, a certain kind of community that doesn't meet that standard may not be able to raise from friends and family. So let's go ahead to the next slide. And so this is just what the current rule around that is. An accredited investor makes at least $200,000 a year for the past 2 years and anticipated to do so moving forward, or $300,000 as a household, or they have $1 million in net worth. And this again is under Reg D Rule 501. The SEC says, oh, don't complicate them. I say, you need to know this because it impacts your fundamental rights. So, this is what the current definition is. And when you look at, a 10x wealth gap plus between, the average white household and Black households and Hispanic households, the huge gaps in the inheritance, the huge gaps in home ownership and equity building, all of this plays into who has the opportunity to raise from friends and family who know them, whose children played Little League together, who have that familiarity and trust it's built in. Okay, next slide. And so this creates a segregated class of investors. So we know that, of the less than 15% of Americans who are accredited investors, which is problematic in and of itself, 1.3% are Black, 2.3% Latinx, around 22% are women. So when you look at like communities of color or BIPOC communities, as you may often hear, Black, Indigenous, people of color, it's less than 1% compared to 10 to 14% for their white counterparts, right? And so this impacts them even being able to become founders, right? And I'll just say, this to me is, a constitutional issue under the 14th Amendment, which promises us equal protections and equal privileges, and that we should not be denied fundamental freedoms without due process. But this in our country, which, we're always, the beauty of our country in the United States is that we can pursue a more perfect union, and it is a country for the people. We, the people, have power, but oftentimes we're so busy in our lives and our work that we don't know, and we haven't learned, and we've not been taught, and so many different interests come into play there. But this is something that I really want you to have on your radar because it's an example of, other ways that you can incorporate, policy and DEI into just your everyday life. Okay, moving on. So what all of this equates to essentially is economic engineering. And, you've seen it in real estate redlining policies in the past, and we've not so much seen it in the tech startup, how it impacts tech startups. But I like to call this startup redlining. And so it often flies under the radar, but it very much is economic engineering. Okay, moving on. So this is, again, a matter of perspective. Like here in this example, what do you see? Do you see a sunken cube? That's what I saw when I first looked at this. Let's go into the next slide. Hopefully this works. No, it doesn't work. Okay, let's go back to that perspective one again. Because if you look at it, there we go. So here you see, from a different perspective, you see a cube going inside of a recessed box, right? So it's a different perspective. And it's, you know, based on your own personal, you know, lived experiences, right? Okay, let's move on.
Is the DEI myths
Okay.
set up?
Yes, perfect. So we have data showing that diverse teams and boards outperform their homogeneous counterparts. And in terms of closing the funding gap, how diversifying teams can also improve representation in cap tables and participation. And that's where, you know, founders like yourselves, many of yourselves, can really make a difference, right? And this is also part of why it's an imperative. You know, why must we unpack this, you know, these entrenched discriminatory biases and these things that have, you know, unfortunately been part of our history. And this is why. And as more diverse operators become part of your founding teams, the more they'll be able to participate in lucrative liquidity events, the more they'll be able to, you know, that they're represented on cap tables, the more they'll be able to reinvest in their communities, right? To increase the pool of diverse startup investors, right? And these are things that are more of an imperative now, and that, you know, policymakers are recognizing. So, you know, that's why it's so important for you all, is another reason why it's important for you all to help bridge the funding gap and to diversify the kinds of problems that we're able to solve, because people who work with you are now able to invest in their communities, are now able to be part of this, you know, innovative, you know, world-changing ecosystem that we're very, very privileged to be part of. Yeah, so next slide.
I love that linkage. I love that linkage you're making. It makes a lot of sense.
So I see, I'm just going to check really here at the beginning. You mentioned purchase the link, but it doesn't show up in my chat. Where did you post it? All right, Erin, I threw a couple links, I think, in the side here to the TED Talk. If I'm missing something, I'll go ahead and just throw all the links in and during the Q&A. So thank you for bringing that to my attention. So, you know, again, like we mentioned at the beginning, DEI can be very uncomfortable, especially if you've been in a bubble where you've not had to deal with it, whereas others may have to deal with it. Like, I can't get away from it. As a mixed person growing up with a white mom every day, kids are like, why is your mom white and you're black? You know, I just couldn't get away from it, right? But sometimes, you know, we have more privileged lives, and there's Black people who live very privileged lives. They may be in a predominantly Black affluent community, like some of my friends, never seen poor Black people, never had to deal with microaggressions, or may be in, you know, communities where they just never experienced racism, and that's wonderful. But, you know, I do realize that for some people who have just never had to deal with it, it can be very difficult. And when, you know, you're trying to be inclusive and big DEI into your startup, you might hit some roadblocks along the way, just because it's just not something that you've had to navigate before. So, you know, as a offshoot of the work that I've done at the Aspen Tech Policy Hub, I created this Startup DEI Pledge. And what it really is, it's actually modeled after the Mekong Club Business Pledge Against Modern Day Slavery, which also is very much influenced by the tech industry. It was designed by someone with a psychology background, and it includes a methodology that enlists the private sector in supporting governments to eradicate modern day slavery and labor exploitation. So basically the Startup DEI Pledge has 4 steps, and I think we can move on to the next slide. It has the assessment. Okay, this is the actual pledge, and I realize that nobody can read this, so don't worry, you can access this on the site, which is Tech Funding Equity. But here there's basically 4 steps. So the first step is assessment, completing the onboarding. And so, you know, we have a very easy process. It's less than 15 minutes. And then, you know, once that assessment is done, companies can begin to implement. They can plan, schedule, and make sure that they're taking on activities that fall within the framework, which we're going to talk about momentarily. The third step is to track, right? So companies schedule a quarterly internal review. It's not something that's published externally. There's not a report card. There's no blame and shame. It's an internal review of the efforts in each category that we're going to go into here momentarily. And then the fourth step is to measure. Companies reassess annually how they're measuring their progress, and they benchmark, right? Okay, next slide. So the pledge also includes a framework that I mentioned earlier that encourages companies to remain engaged by providing practical guidelines, external accountability, positive encouragement, and support. So again, when I say external accountability, this is not name, blame, shame. This is like, hey, I'm having a hard time here, or hey, I'm going to participate in this annual survey. So there are 4 parts of the framework. The first is assimilation. And this is the process of taking in and fully understanding the tech funding equity approach to optimizing your unique culture, not by blending in or conforming, but by innovating and recalibrating for excellence, right? So this is not the assimilation of the minoritized population trying to be like the predominant population. This is about understanding and taking in the information. And so the main component of that is just awareness raising. Next is engagement, and that builds upon the company's efforts to collect and assimilate information to support their performance goals, right? So this is not about quotas, but we can set goals just like any other area of business excellence or performance. We have our KPIs, right? It's the same kind of thing that you want to do with your culture, and particularly when it comes to DE&I. So the engagement category has 2 subcategories. It has to do with your policy and governance. And so there's resources out there that can help just like leapfrog you and accelerate you in creating policies and governance that your company can grow into. The next part of it is execution, where now you've got all this stuff laid out, right? You've got your policies and governance aligned. And then the next step is executing on that. And that involves recruiting internally and externally, creating, allocating, and disseminating resources, building your capacity, and monitoring your progress. And so the subcategories that support its execution are recruitment, again, resources, monitoring, and building capacity. And then finally, entrenchment. So, we talked about entrenchment and retrenchment a little bit. So as companies execute on the actions that they have committed, they might experience some newfound or heightened diversity fatigue. Okay, so you're doing the work, some of this is uncomfortable, you put your foot in your mouth, and I've done that myself, okay? So if it happens to you, you're not alone. But again, it can be fatiguing, particularly as biases and cognitive dissonance are explored, examined, and dismantled, sometimes even confronted. And some people on the other end of a spectrum, they have their own fatigue, right? Like I tell people, folks sometimes, talk about my candor, and I'm like, and it depends on what day you get me, because I'm normally just like very, very tolerant, but, come at me on a day when there's been another, senseless Black murder, or come at me on a day where I've, had to endure microaggressions. I will tell people, look, I don't have the bandwidth for that today. And so don't press me. And if you press me, watch out now, right? So, sometimes those things happen where people are just tired and they just have no patience, no filter. And so, sometimes that can cause fatigue, and that can lead to that progress and retrenchment that we talked about earlier. So the areas of this are, tied to this, the subcategories tied to this include compensation, elevation, and mentoring. And that mentoring is not just like, oh, I'm going to go mentor this underrepresented person. It's also, I'm in leadership, I need to get this. Who can coach me on how to be better at incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion? So that kind of goes back to that cultural competency part, right? When we had the left and the right example of equity. So again, within each subcategory, companies can pull from suggested actions or not, and we have a whole list of actions that can support these subcategories. They can create their own actions, and they can optionally contribute to a list of suggestions that can be shared out with others who are doing this work. And so not all companies need to adopt the same actions, but they should commit to undergoing this internal analysis, determining what actions they are going to take, and remaining accountable, whether it's internally and or externally, to implement and track those actions. Okay, so moving on. That was a lot to take in. So people who go through this process, then they're able to receive a certificate of participation, or you can go back up to the certificate. There we go. Perfect. And we have a technology partner, MTrain, which is a cultural analytics platform. And much of the work that they do around benchmarking on not only diversity, equity, inclusion, but compliance and anti-harassment and other issues is designed for companies that have over 200 employees. But for us, they have incorporated some of these resources to support founders who are starting up. And the ideal stage is when you have less than 15 employees, because that's when you're really building your culture. And it's so much easier to build that culture from the ground up than to retrofit it, right? And have to, deal with a toxic culture within, and where people don't want to stay, and you have the revolving door and a lot of a harder time retaining even the talent that you've worked so hard to recruit, right? So that's the first step of just completing the pledge, the complimentary assessment, and again, it can be completed in under 15 minutes, and you'll get the access to these resources. Okay, so next.
And Mariah, just a quick question. You talked about internal capacity as part of the execution pillar. For companies that are not in a position yet to hire a head of diversity, equity, and inclusion, what kind of recommendations do you have for building up internal capacity if you're just not at that phase where you can have a dedicated executive in that role?
That's where that term diversity includes you comes in, because as a fellow founder, we wear many hats, and you are the DEI person. And so that's where these resources that MTrain has been so generous to provide can really, and what I love about this is that these are resources that you can, participate in from the comfort of your home. The way that their modules work, oftentimes they'll be like short surveys and little videos that are just so on point and well done and entertaining, where you can say, oh, I get it. Like, we learn so much how to empathize through literature and movies. And oftentimes I've said, and we've talked about this before, Courtney, in the tech industry, we focus so much on that left brain side of things that we forget the humanity, right? And oftentimes we don't have a cultural context. We're not, the philosophers and the liberal artists necessarily. So we may not have done some of that work. But these little short videos really help us to assimilate that information. And then it also shows you how you benchmark, compared to your peers. So it's work that founders themselves can do. And then when they do hire that DEI person, they know how to delegate, right? They know what that person is working on, because at the end of the day, it's going to be the C-suite that has ownership of everything that happens in the company. So it really is top down, and it really can start with one person. And even better if you have two or more, right? Because again, it's not something that you just want to put off to the side and put on some other person and be like, oh, you go take care of that, because that's really not integrating, right? It's not really, you are the visionary of your culture. You're the architect of your culture. So it really starts with you. All right, so again, like I mentioned, the Aspen Tech Policy Hub project, and I just want to share that this Startup DEI Pledge is an offshoot of the Tech Funding Equity Opportunity Pledge, which is more geared towards limited partners who invest in venture capitalists like myself, venture capitalists, angel groups, accelerators, et cetera. And this is a resource that's been recognized by the Institutional Limited Partner Association and the Tech Funding Equity Project at large. You can see that, there's a lot of articles. And if you do follow me on LinkedIn, I often share and have these things listed in my profile. There's been, op-eds in Fortune and Law 360, and other folks have, covered the policy side of the work that we're doing in public policy, like with the Securities and Exchange Commission, and also the private side, which everyone on this call is likely a part of. So just wanted to share that. And with that, we can move on to Q&A.
Wonderful. Sorry, I was muted there. Thank you, Mariah, for that. That was excellent presentation. We appreciate you preparing that for us. I'm just looking at the chat here.
I'm going to go and start pulling links, by the way.
Q&A. So there's one question here. What a wonderful presentation. I agree. In the beginning, you mentioned DEI and B, and the pledge focuses on DEI. Where does the B for belonging fit into DEI? Are D, E, and I the building blocks that must first exist for belonging to foster?
Absolutely. So the diversity, equity, and inclusion, when it's executed, and again, top down is a great way to go, that can facilitate a sense of the B, which is belonging. So belonging is something that each individual, can only feel for themselves. But the diversity, equity, and inclusion are things that you can incorporate into your culture yourself. It's a great question. Thank you.
Wonderful. So I actually realized we are over time here. It was so fun. It went so quickly. If there's any other questions that anybody wants to submit, we'll just give maybe another minute here.
And you can contact me. Please do feel free, or reach out through Courtney. I think I put my email there, and I'm happy to answer questions that you may have.
And it looks like there's some confusion about where the links are. So what I'll do is gather these links from you, Mariah, and I can send these out in an email after the talk to anybody who's registered to make sure that you've gotten them if you were not able to see them. Oh, actually, Mariah, if you, I think they're just going to panel.
Oh, no, okay.
That's okay. So we'll
That's
stay on
why they
here.
disappeared.
Sorry about that. So we'll stay on here for a couple more minutes while those get reposted. But Mariah, I just want to thank you so much for sharing your perspective and expertise with us on an issue that's very important that we all need to be focused on and working on and paying attention to. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you again for having me, and I look forward to hearing from some of you. Okay, I think we got all those links in there, and if I missed anything, then I'm happy to share them out. And to do also, Courtney, feel free to share the presentation. I tried to put the links embedded in some of those slides as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And for anybody who's been on who wants to share this more broadly, this will be on the ESG page of the 500 Startups website in the next week or two. And we will also be sharing it on our YouTube channel. So just stay tuned. That should be up in a couple of days. But Mariah, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. Thank you for your wonderful presentation and for sharing your perspective and your expertise with us to help advance this work.
Thank you. And thank you to 500 Startups for the incredible work that's happening and the global impact. I feel very honored to be a part. Thank you.
Likewise, we were really honored to have you. So thank you. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.